Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar for the City of Santa Barbara's proposed water rates. I just want to cover a few housekeeping items before our panelists begin. So this is a Zoom webinar, which operates a little bit differently than a Zoom meeting, and that you'll only be hearing and seeing the panelists tonight, and everyone else is muted without camera access. We will be recording this webinar, and the recording will be posted on the city's webpage in English and Spanish, and we anticipate that being next week. You can answer any questions at any point using the Q&A feature down below. Just type them in at any point in the webinar, and we will be getting to them at the end of the presentation, which we anticipate being about 40 minutes tonight. And now I'd like to introduce our Acting Water Resources Manager, Amanda Flessy.
The rates will also cover the cost of providing services and also our treatment and regulations. Costs are providing services and must be proportionally allocated among customers and classifications, such as residential, commercial, and irrigation users. The chart there to your right just kind of gives you an idea of how much a gallon of water is compared to other common household products, such as bottled water. A gallon of our water is only 2 cents compared to bottled water being $5.15 on average, or a gallon of milk, or even a gallon of gasoline, which is also going up. So hopefully throughout this presentation, we'll give you a good background and give you some good information and let you know what it is that we are planning to do with our water rate increases. So with that, I'd like to introduce Malcolm Hamilton, our financial officer, that will kind of go through step by step of the rate increase.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. So jumping right into our agenda for tonight, I did want to take a look back really quickly at the timeline of how we got here with rates and what upcoming meetings people can participate in. We want to look at the financial planning, so some of the major cost drivers in our rate study and what we're doing there and how that's leading to the proposed rates. We'll look at our rate study considerations and objectives, so how we structure our rates to promote conservation and achieve our efficient water use goals. Ultimately, we have our rate consultant here on the webinar, and we will turn it over to him for a few slides to explain about how he studied the rates and the analysis he did to come to his conclusions. And then we'll look at rate study outcomes, so some sample bill impacts for our customers, and then look at a comparison of Santa Barbara's water rates to neighboring agencies. And then finally, at the end, as Madeline said at the beginning, we'll have an opportunity to take questions and provide answers. So over the last several months, we've been doing a lot of public outreach, particularly in public meetings. So with the Water Commission, the Finance Committee, and City Council, starting back in September, we've kind of gone to these individual bodies multiple times to discuss what is going into the rates, what we're expecting, how COVID-19 impacted our financial plan, and ultimately brought the proposed rates that we're presenting today to these different bodies. On June 15th, and we'll reiterate this, so June 15th, 2021, the public hearing is scheduled before City Council, and it'll be a joint public hearing on water rates and trash and recycling rates. And at the end of the presentation, we'll give you some information on how you can learn more about trash and recycling rates as well. So jumping right into the financial planning aspects, I think it's important to maybe start with a higher level view of what kind of assets comprise the water system in general, and what we need to maintain to ensure that we're delivering safe and reliable water to our customers. We have about 27,000 customer accounts. We serve approximately 95,000 customers, large majority within the city limits, but we have some customers in the unincorporated areas of the county. The biggest asset, and we'll talk more about this in the presentation of the water system, is our water mains. So we have just over 300 miles of water mains, And as we'll talk about, they require a consistent annual effort to maintain and replace. We have 13 reservoirs, pump stations, and the system's fairly complex. We have 17 different pressure zones. So our treatment and distribution systems, as graded by the state of California, have the highest complexity designations. So there is a lot that goes into maintaining the system. And then additionally, we have 3 water treatment plants. So pictured here on the right is an aerial image of the Cater Water Treatment Plant up in the San Roque area. If you ever take the Jesucita Trail, it's you likely parked right next to the plant and then taken the trail. The other 2 treatment plants are our Ortega Groundwater Treatment Plant and also the Charles E. Meyer Desalination Plant. I want to take an opportunity to look at the functional components of our expenses. So what is depicted here is a sample of our next year's proposed budget, but broken out in our functional groups. So supply management, water treatment, water distribution, debt service, our general administration functions, and capital investment. And looking at this chart, focusing on the right-hand side, you can see that capital investment is a pretty significant component of the expenses we anticipate incurring in the next year, and also in the next years after that. This hasn't always been the case. As we'll explain later on, we are proposing to increase our capital investment in the water system, and so it is requiring a larger portion of our budget and rates that go along with it. On the flip side of that, we can look at the revenue sources for the water fund or the water utility. Here is a donut chart of all the different sources of incomes. The blue shaded region is rate revenue. So this is revenue generated from fixed monthly service charges and volumetric charges from our customer bills. Makes up about 90% of our total revenues. And this is a snapshot, I believe, from the current year. And now these other revenue sources are non-rate revenues, and those buy down what we need to collect in rates and what we need to collect in rates and what otherwise drives rate increases. What's not depicted here, and we'll talk more about later, is we're going to see a changing mixture of these revenue sources, one of which is we've executed a water supply agreement with a neighboring agency, the Montecito Water District, and we will be providing them water annually, and there will be compensation for that to the city, so that will increase our non-rate revenues. And then additionally, the city's recently done a really good job at developing a robust grant strategy. So pursuing any and all grants that we're eligible for that will help take pressure off of future rate increases. I showed a breakdown functionally of our system cost, but we tend to often talk about system costs in 2 broad categories. So there are operating costs, what we consider our day-to-day or recurring expenses that we incur to provide services every year. And then the other types of costs are capital costs. So these are investment in physical assets. This is investment in infrastructure, pipelines, our water treatment plant. Again, here's a picture of the Cater Water Treatment Plant. And as well as numerous other assets, and we'll give you an example of each of those as we go through. So the cost trends for both operating and capital costs are kind of laid out here. Operating costs, what we tend to experience on average over the medium to long term is an increase of about 3 to 3.5% in these costs annually. Additionally, in recent years with capital investment, we've been increasing that investment in our physical assets. And so we're trying to address this backlog of deferred maintenance. The primary goals here are, of course, to provide reliable and safe drinking water to our customers, and also more recently to meet the annual water main replacement goal of 2 miles, which was set by City Council in 2018. Now, as I was mentioning, with that last slide, what we're experiencing in operating costs is about a 3 to 3.5% increase in expenses every single year. And if we were to adopt rates that were less than that, then over time our services to the community would diminish. So at a minimum, we tend to target 3% as the annual rate increase just to keep pace with the cost of doing business. However, now what we're proposing are rate increases above that amount. And the purpose of those rate increases is really to support a higher level of capital investment. And that's very particularly going to be directed at our pipeline infrastructure, water quality and reliability improvements, for our reservoirs, and also for baseline capital that occurs every year for all of those assets that I mentioned earlier. Turning to pipeline replacement, I'd first like to focus on this chart on the right. And what you see here is a chart of the miles of water main pipelines installed per decade. And the orange part of the bars is cast iron pipe, and the gray part is ductile iron. So, but it is no surprise that in the 1950s and 1960s that we had dramatic population growth. But along with that, we also had dramatic growth in our water distribution infrastructure. What we're experiencing now, though, is that the cast iron pipes that went into the ground in the 1950s and 1960s are coming to the end of their useful life, and they need to be replaced. And primarily, we have two goals when we're doing that. We're trying to reduce emergency repairs, which are extremely costly when compared to planned replacement projects. And secondly, we want to maintain our service reliability for our customers. This gives a little bit of a different look at the pipeline replacement in the city. The map on the right shows all of the pipelines that were installed, cast iron pipeline that was installed between 1900 and 1960 in the city. So as you can tell, it's not particularly concentrated in any one area. It's very spread out across the entire service area. Right now, this pipeline makes up about 44% of our total distribution system. So that's about 135 miles that's out there and will need to be replaced in the coming years. Now, towards that end, City Council did take steps in 2018 to replace these pipelines, but at a greater rate. So the goal now is to replace 6 miles of water mains annually. The previous goal by City Council was 3 miles, so they doubled their annual goal. And with that, we need to adopt rates that support the goal of replacing 6 miles of water mains annually. The previous rate study that we did in 2017 only supported a replacement goal of about 3 miles annually. And now we're moving to 6. And so we need to, in the long run, adopt rates that are sustainable to support that. We are doing a lot of investment in pipelines. We're also doing investment in our water quality and reliability. A project that's going to be upcoming in the next year is a new conveyance pipeline. The city is going to construct a new pipeline, and it's going to link the Charles E. Meyer desalination plant to the Cater water treatment plant. And by doing that, we're going to be able to blend the surface water supplies with desalinated water. And the result of that is going to be a more consistent supply across the entire city's service area. So currently, desalinated water is, the delivery of desalinated water is limited into the downtown area. So the area kind of just around the plant, and extends a little bit west and a little bit to the east side as well. But when we're able to take that desalinated water up to the Cater water treatment plant, we not only can deliver it to anywhere in the city, so we improve our supply reliability for everyone, we also will get a more consistent supply when we blend those surface and desalinated water supplies together. And finally, on capital investment, we have 2 significant reservoir replacement projects coming up. The Cater Reservoir Resiliency Project proposes to build a backup reservoir at the Cater treatment plant. And by doing that, we're going to increase the redundancy of infrastructure there. So we will be able to work on our primary reservoir at the Cater plant, but also being able to serve the city at the same time. It will also ensure that we continue to meet our water quality standards as set by the state and the federal government. Now, by doing the Cater Reservoir project We also, with that new backup reservoir, will be able to work on the Vic Trace reservoir. And the Vic Trace reservoir is an aging reservoir in the system, but it plays an important function in serving a great area of the entire city. So by doing the Cater project, we will also be able to do the Vic Trace replacement. These two projects are fairly expensive projects on their own and would be difficult to fund from cash or from reserves. So in this rate study, what we're proposing to do is to finance these new projects, which will spread the costs out over time and reduce the annual rate burden for any given year. Now I'd like to turn and talk about our different, how we set up the rates, the rate structure, and some of the objectives and how they're designed. If we look back recently to some of our recent rate changes, we did a rate study that was adopted in July of 2017. And in that rate study, many of our volumetric charges were held flat for the last several years. So single family residential, multifamily residential, the irrigation classes have not seen an increase in their volumetric rates in the last 4 years. We did increase our fixed monthly service charges annually, approximately 5% annually. However, last year there was no increase as City Council decided to forego the proposed rate increase due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So in 2017 was the last time the city has updated its rates. The monthly bill that you receive as a city water customer is comprised of two components. So there's a fixed component, which is not based on actual water use. It really is based on your meter size, and it recovers a portion of the fixed cost of operating the water system. It does not recover nearly all of the fixed costs. It only recovers approximately 30% of the total cost that is required to operate the water system. The other component of the bill is the variable charges. So this fluctuates based on your water use. You may know that these are billed in units of HCF, so that's 750 gallons. And our tiered system is structured in terms of the HCF unit. Particularly, the rate structure is designed to encourage conservation. So 70% of our revenues come from volumetric charges, 30% come from fixed charges. By doing that, customers are able to lower their bill when they lower their water use. And so it gives customers more control over their bill as opposed to a rate structure where a larger percentage is recovered from fixed costs. We also have a very diverse water supply portfolio, which really supports a tiered structure to our rates. Council has taken action and set priorities for the uses of least expensive to most expensive water. So the first tier of water in each of our customer classes per council policy is allocated our least expensive water sources. And as we get higher in the tiers and we move into efficient and then discretionary uses, so these would be tiers 2 and 3 in the rate classes, the water per unit gets more expensive for your volumetric use. What have we done recently to minimize rate impacts to our customers? So there's really kind of 4 big components here. The first being financial planning. We've talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the webinar. By investing in the system now, we reduce emergency repairs in the future. And emergency repairs can be 3 to 4 times more expensive than planned work. So by, for instance, investing in our pipelines, we will reduce water main breaks in the future and reduce the cost to our customers over time. We also, and I touched on this briefly, are recommending that we replace debt that we're about to pay off with new debt so that we can finance certain large projects over time. The city has also implemented, or the Water Resources Division has implemented, a comprehensive grant pursuit strategy. So we are identifying, pursuing, and ultimately positioning ourselves to be eligible for as many grants as possible and receiving as many awards as possible. We recently received grants for advanced metering infrastructure and that desal conveyance link pipeline that I mentioned previously. A lot of this has to do with the relationships we've developed with the Bureau of Reclamation through the U.S. Department of the Interior. They have some recurring grants that come out annually, and the city has made it a point to position ourselves every year to have projects ready for those grants. We have also recently executed 2 water supply agreements. So the city is going to be maximizing the benefits from our assets, using capacity in existing assets, for instance, our desalination plant and our recycled water plant, to execute agreements with Montecito Water District and La Cumbre Mutual Water Company for recycled water. And finally, customer assistance. So we have a lot of programs here for our customers, and some of you may have used these before, but water checkups, we offer free water checkups. Right now, I believe we're doing them virtually, and those have been a great success. Leak relief, so if you have kind of unexplained water use, we have a policy for that and can assist you. Users, the UUT waiver is the user's utility tax waiver. So if you're a qualifying customer, low-income customer, you can have this tax waived that is applied to all of our city utility bills. We have rebates for certain incentive programs for installing efficient fixtures and those types of projects. And then finally, bill relief, and I mentioned this here, it's not in place yet, but the rates that we're proposing set aside a small amount of money to be available for an expanded low-income rate assistance program. And we're developing that now. And once the rates are adopted, we'll be able to bring the details of administration of that new program to the public and roll that out. So with that, I want to turn this over to Sean Korn from HDR Engineering, the city's rate consultant, to talk a little bit about the process that he went through in developing the rates and coming to his conclusions.
Thank you, Malcolm. Good evening, everybody. As we go through our rate study, there are several items that we need to go through and develop to meet the overall requirements of setting water rates based on state requirements, so really the California Constitution, as well as overall goals and objectives that the city outlines as we go through this process. So we developed the study over the last year, working with staff, and most of this information is based on what Malcolm has described to you, and I'll go a little bit more into detail into that as we go through these next few slides. As we kick off a rate study, we always start with what the overall rate setting goals and objectives are. And these are generally accepted goals and objectives. They're out there in the industry literature. And I'll walk through each of these briefly to touch on how we incorporated these goals that were identified at the start of the city study. The first goal is revenue sufficiency and stability. And really the revenue sufficiency goal is tied into the overall process of developing proposed rate revenues that are sufficient to fund the operating and capital needs that the city has identified over this next multi-year period. And this year, in this case, focus on the next 3 years for the proposed rates. So this looks at when Malcolm was talking about the annual operating and maintenance expense, so the actual cost to provide and produce the water, and then the infrastructure cost for that process of delivering that water to each of the city's customers. So the analysis has taken that overall cost and developed a projection based on the known changes that the city's incurred over the last several years to develop that. On the revenue stability side, this is really one of the primary purposes of a rate study is to be proactive and looking forward and making sure that rates aren't going up and down each year, but being able to project what those rate revenues need to be to adequately fund the utility, as well as provide that information to you all and the rest of the city's customers. As we go through this process, we also need to make sure that we meet some of the legally required financial metrics that the city has in place. One of the primary one being the annual debt service coverage ratio. So when the city has issued debt in the past, they need to meet the overall requirements of borrowing those funds to pay back over time. We also have council policies. Malcolm mentioned one of those on the capital infrastructure funding side with the 6 miles of main replacement. We also have council policies on the level of reserves that are kept to fund in case of emergencies or future impacts that were unforeseen. As we look at affordability, this is really a combination of a couple items, but one of those is looking at the overall customer bill, how that impacts customers, bringing in the discussion that Malcolm ended on his prior slide with how there are assistance programs for customers, as well as having a larger portion of the utility bill be based on the actual water consumption so that customers have a better ability to adjust their usage and reduce their bill. That also plays into our efficient use of resources, how we've developed the rate structure to reflect the overall needs of the community and providing that, again, that incentive for reduced usage to lower your bill as part of that conservation effort. A key element of meeting the legal requirements is an equitable, cost-based, and proportional rate structure. And the equity component really reflects the cost of service analysis that I'll talk about in a moment, but how each customer class pays their proportional share of the cost based on how they utilize the system. And so it's a detailed analysis based on the city's specific costs and each customer class's specific use of the system. We also want to make sure that the rates are easy to understand and administer so that you all as customers understand why your bill is what it is each time you receive that, as well as easy for the city to administer. And then finally, and one of the key elements and one of the primary purposes of developing a rate study is to be legally defendable. And that really means meeting the intent of Proposition 218, which is noted in the California Constitution, which outlines the point that the rates must be cost-based and proportional for the customers. So in order to do that, on the next slide, we have a summary of the rate study process. And it's a 3-step process where there's a revenue requirement, a cost of service, and a rate design. That revenue requirement really is what we talked about previously on the revenue sufficiency. It's determining the overall level of revenue, so the revenue donut chart that Malcolm showed you, and how that compares to the expenses, both operating and capital, that are necessary to continue to provide safe, clean, reliable water to the city's customers. We look at this on an annual basis for a multi-year period. The rate study looked out over 10 years with a focus on the next 3 years for rate setting purposes. Once we've developed that revenue requirement, then the next step is to really to provide the requirement to meet Proposition 218. This is where we equitably allocate and distribute the overall cost to each customer class based on how they utilize the system. So as Malcolm talked about, the various different sources that are in place and how the council has prioritized those sources, then ultimately that provides a primary basis for how we allocate costs based on which source is allocated to customers. We also then need to get the water to customers and be able to provide that overall need, regardless of whether it's in the winter or during the summer peak when we're all watering our lawns, washing our cars, et cetera, so that we're able to continue to provide service to all customers. The results of the cost of service really provide us with cost-based rates. So the revenue requirement tells us the total level of revenue that's necessary. The cost of service then tells us what those unit costs are per 100 cubic feet or HCF or per meter charge that ultimately become the rates in year 1 of the rate design analysis. So in year 1, we reset the rates from the 2017 study and the adjustments that have been made since that time to reflect the cost of service. So the charges by tier or budget or allotment, and then the fixed customer charge. And then in years 2 and 3, it's an overall adjustment based on the revenue requirement needs that are reflected in the development of the study. So in summary, on the next slide, we have the overall rate study conclusions. Based on the need to fund the operating and capital needs over the next 3 years, we're projecting an overall revenue adjustment of 5%. And that's really driven by a couple of items. One, as Malcolm talked about, the overall inflationary impacts to O&M costs, the operation and maintenance costs, and as well as the transition to a higher level of capital investment. And that's meeting that 2% or the 6 miles of the city's water mains and funding those important water supply and reliability projects. So to meet those capital funding needs to continue to provide the high level of service to the city's customers. Now, an important point to add to the inflationary discussion is that the utility costs don't always track with the typical consumer price index. These are items that we're looking at for utility, our electricity and chemicals, concrete, steel, that don't always follow the typical CCI index that we think about when we look at this. And so finally, as I talked about with the overall cost of service, that 5% rate adjustment is most likely not the exact impact that customers will see to their bills. Based on the cost of service analysis, customers' bills will vary slightly depending on the type of service and customer class they are, and Malcolm will talk about that here in a moment, as well as the overall customer use, so depending on how customers utilize the system. So to summarize, overall, we've gone through a comprehensive approach to establish the proposed rates based on cost of service principles and the city's unique customer characteristics and costs to meet the overall requirements to develop cost-based and proportional rates. With that, I will turn it back over to Malcolm.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Appreciate that. So now to wrap up the presentation, we want to look at some of the outcomes that Sean was just talking about with the rates. In this table, we've put various different anticipated bill impacts for different customer classes. So on the left-hand side is our customer type, and we've listed single-family residential, multifamily residential, commercial, and irrigation. We have 2 columns for the current monthly bill and what the proposed monthly bill would be under the proposed rates, the difference in a dollar amount, and then finally on the right-hand side, a percentage change for that bill. So as we look at the single-family residential, the low water user, so someone who residents that's using 4 HCF per month will see their bill increase just about 3%. At 10 HCF, it's a flat 5%. And as we get into higher water use, around 20 HCF, that increase will be about 6.3% in their monthly bill. Now, the multifamily volumetric charge and fixed charge is the same as single family residences, but they have a slightly different tiering structure. So we wanted to show an example here. If you're in a, for instance, if you're somebody like a landlord who owns a 4-unit multifamily development and you use 20 HCF across all of the units with the 1-inch meter, your bill will go up about $8.39 a month, or 4.4%. We also wanted to look at how it's impacting our commercial, how these rates would impact our commercial sector, especially in light of COVID-19. So for instance, here we use the word popular restaurant, but we're talking about just a well-trafficked restaurant using 70 HCF and staying within their allotment. Our commercial customers have a rate structure that gives them a monthly allotment as their first tier, and anything over the allotment, there's a higher charge for that water use. So a restaurant that uses 70 HCF and they're within their allotment is going to see about a 0.5% increase, a little more, in their monthly bill. Now, if you're a restaurant and you go 10% over your allotment for that month, your bill will be about a 2.4% increase from where it is now. And then finally, looking at 2 different irrigation accounts, based on the cost of service study, we are seeing more significant increases for our irrigation agriculture and our irrigation recreation customers. So depending on if you're agriculture, your monthly bill will be about a little more than 9% more than it is now. And if you're an irrigation recreation customer, it will be just about 7% more than it is now. And initially, the rates that we brought forward to our Water Commission and Finance Committee had not smoothed out these increases, so they were a little bit higher in earlier presentations, but we are bringing forward a proposal that will smooth these increases out for these two customer classes over the 3-year rate study period. Now, as we look at our rates and put them into the context of South Coast water agencies, this chart shows the comparison of monthly bills across City of Santa Barbara, Toledo Water District, Montecito Water District, and Carpinteria Valley Water District. This chart isn't particularly surprising if you think about how we structure our rates and the council policy that the lowest cost water goes to the priority uses, so our tier 1 water. So for instance, if you're using 4 HCF, that's our tier 1 water, you would pay the lowest monthly bill on the South Coast. If you're using tier 1 and tier 2 water, so a moderate water user, 10 HCF, your monthly bill would be $130.67 a month, which is very comparable to our neighboring agencies. And then as we get into higher water use, these bills tend to be higher than our neighboring agencies, such as Toledo and Montecito and Carpinteria. And finally, we're often asked, how does it fit into the big picture of the utility bill? So what we have here on screen is a monthly utility bill example for the whole city. So this includes water, wastewater, solid waste, and the user's utility tax, the UUT. This is for some moderate water users, so 10 HCF, and someone whose trash and recycling service is 65-gallon trash, green waste, and they have a once per week service. Overall, the proposal amongst all the utilities would increase their bill 5.5%, their monthly bill 5.5%. Now, we've done a lot of talk about sample bill impacts, but you may be wondering, how does it very specifically impact me? How would these rates, the proposed rates, impact my water bill? I would encourage you right now, if you have your phone available, you can open up your photo app, and if you just hover over the QR code in the top right here, it will take you to our water rate calculator page. And so that's santabarbaraca.gov/rate calculator. And when you get to that page, you can customize this to the type of customer you are. So your property type, your meter size, how much water you use monthly, and hit calculate, and it will tell you what your bill will be. So finally here, what are the next steps? As I mentioned, we have a public hearing scheduled on June 15th, 2021. So that's Tuesday, June 15th. City Council will be considering rate increases for water and trash and recycling. It's undetermined at this time, but very likely that this meeting will take place online. The meeting details will be posted on the city's main webpage, santabarbaraca.gov, and all the information is there to sign up for the GoToWebinar. If you want more information on the proposed trash and recycling rates, we didn't cover that today, but you can go to santabarbaraca.gov/recycling, and you have all the information there, including a copy of their Proposition 218 rate notice. And then finally, just to reiterate that this presentation today is being given in English, but we will have a Spanish version posted online within a week of tonight, available for the city. With that concludes our presentation, and we'd be happy to take questions.
All right, thank you, Malcolm. So let's see, our first question. What is the increase in salary, benefits, and retirement costs relative to the 3% annual increase in expenses that you mentioned?
Yeah, thank you, Madeline. So I don't know specifically how salary and benefits contribute to the 3%, but what I do know is that overall salary and benefits make up a little bit less than 20% of the overall cost of operating the water utility. So this is really kind of different than many of the other governmental departments, where their salary and benefit costs can make up a significant portion of their operating budget. Ours tends to be a lot less because we have, like we mentioned in the presentation, we have pretty significant investment in capital costs. and a very large contract service portion of our budget. So it's not particularly impactful on the rate increases, the salary and benefit costs.
And you talked about grants. So if the city secures grants for some of those capital projects that you're talking about, will the ratepayers see any kind of rebate or reimbursement?
So the rates, and Sean, feel free to jump in, but the rates are developed on a projected basis. Depending on the level of grant funding that's received, I would say that it's in the realm of possibility that future rate increases could be less than what we had originally anticipated. But in terms of a reweight, we would not expect that to occur. Typically, if we have any surpluses in revenues, we put those in reserves, and later on, we adopt rates that are lower than they would be otherwise and use reserves to buffer those lower rates.
Yeah, Malcolm, I would just add to that also that the proposed rates are the maximum rates that can be adopted by the city council under the 218 process. And so those rates, if the city were to do something less than that, the city council determined that it would be less given the level of grants that came in. As Malcolm stated, then those future years would be ones that can be evaluated as the city goes through their budgeting process. And that's how most utilities will deal with that, is fund those projects and then ultimately carry that forward and rebalance the model as they use that each year to establish their budget and reflect those changes in rates in the future.
Thank you. What about Measure C? Does Measure C funding, which is for infrastructure, cover water infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's something we absolutely want to cover. There is no Measure C funding currently allocated to the water utility. So the water utility is completely self-sufficient. So using those revenues, we talked about rate revenue primarily, and then some non-rate revenue sources. My understanding is that nothing prevents an allocation. Those are general tax dollars and can be allocated to any city department, but currently they are not allocated in any way to the water utility.
And you've been talking about a 5% rate revenue increase. So is that 5% over 3 years or 5% per year for the next 3 years?
That is 5% per year over the next 3 years.
All right, those are all the questions we have at this point. As Malcolm said, there is a website down below, santabarbaraca.gov/water rate changes. We also encourage you to take a look at our water rate calculator as well. Malcolm's email is down below for any further questions. And we want to thank you all for attending tonight, asking your questions, and this recording will be posted on our website, hopefully early next week. Thank you everyone for attending.